Alright, it's Yalak here again, and it's Wednesday, September 14th, 2016. I want to talk here another time about this modern Hebrew language, the way we've got it. I showed in the first lesson regarding this modern Hebrew that there seems to be a problem that I'm considering regarding the status or place, or I should say the credibility of this modern Hebrew, the way we've got it presented to us. Now, I know usually we say, oh, they just made slight changes to the way it's written just so we can figure out the pronunciation and learn it easier and so on, right? But I'm really wondering, so I'm hoping someone hearing this over the course of time will have some clearer information to help those of us who are interested in this kind of information looking into it. I know I certainly am. I am not clear that Hebrew itself, the way we've got it today, was the language that the Hebrews were speaking. I'm not clear on that, so I can't say it is not, but I think that the Hebrew we've got today was not the language they were speaking. And I don't just mean it's not the way because maybe how it sounds in modern times and so on, and the little vowel pointers that they put in, but I mean the whole language itself, right? I don't think it was. But I'm looking into it, right? So I'm searching it. So I mean, you got to take the information I'm giving here and think of it yourself, and see what you come up with. But I just wonder. Anyway, it's just food for thought. Now, I want to point out a few things here that's really interesting to me, because there's a verse in the Bible that does talk about the Jews' language, and it just, we're on all this hype about Hebrew, 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 and they've convinced us coming out of slavery that Hebrew was the language of the Bible. And if the Bible is really about the Hebrew people, why did it have to be stated in the Jews' language? It's like, it just sounds kind of funny, like, I don't know. Anyway, I've been looking at different languages lately, looking at the Shemitic languages, and, it's just interesting. The more you study, the more you read, the more you think, the more you learn, and you start to piece things together, right? And learning Torah is actually really interesting. I mean, there's really nothing like it. There's really nothing like it. There's just so much in it that you just never really stop thinking, you never stop studying, you never stop learning, right? For the ones who really want it deep in their heart. Now, here, some people are saying Aramaic was the language that the Hebrews spoke and the people of Shem spoke, right? So even before the nation of Israel was actually called out of Egypt. And that's what some people say. And if that is correct, because I'm young, studying this topic, right, of the language of the Bible, the real language. So, I mean, I'm hearing other people, I'm remembering what I was told by others, and I'm thinking through. But if it's correct that it's Aramaic, and where did this Hebrew come from? Unless someone's going to say Aramaic is actually Hebrew, it's just called Hebrew now. But that doesn't seem to, stand up properly. with my little knowledge here. But if Aramaic was a language, then I'm going to point out something interesting about this modern Hebrew that we have at the end of this recording. Alright, so I'm going to read a little bit from websites online. And I've got a book here I'm going to mention something from as well. So when you look at Aramaic now, we are told by many that Aramaic was the original language. In the book of Daniel, the evil king Belshazzar, and this is from a book called The Assyrians, the Oldest Christian People by Stephen Messick. The evil king Belshazzar, through the writing on his wall, in this story, the hand of the Most High wrote on the wall in the king's palace in Aramaic, in Daniel chapter 5 and verse 25, right? This warning, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, translated from the Aramaic, spelt out the king's doom. And they're saying a large selection of the book of the prophet Daniel is written in Aramaic. Alright, from Daniel 2 verse 4 up to Daniel chapter 7 verse 28. Some people say it wasn't that long, that much that was written, maybe 2 chapters. But at least you know Aramaic is said to have been in the book of Daniel. Even the stories with Daniel in the lion's den and the story with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, those parts were written, they're saying, in Aramaic. Now, keep in mind, my focus is on the modern Hebrew. So what I'm saying here about Aramaic is meant to expose or show something about the Hebrew, which is going to come in the form of a question at the end of all this, right? Because as I showed before, this kind of modern Hebrew seems to have popped up around, around 1000 BC. This modern Hebrew seems to have popped up fairly late when you consider that there are other languages before Hebrew. So if all these other languages were, if you see my first video dealing with Hebrew, called What Hebrew, then if there were so many other languages before this Hebrew, how could Hebrew have been the original language when the people of Shem, who were dealing with the word of the Most High, were speaking other languages then, right? Or some other kind of language, seeing that the Hebrew came later on. They must have been speaking something else, right? So you can understand my consideration here. Now, when you look at Aramaic, if you look at Wikipedia, they're saying here, Aram Damascus was an Aramean state around Damascus in Syria, right? And they mention Aramean kingdoms, right? The map of territory of the ancient Syrians, right? And you're going to see pop up there Aram Damascus, right? It was the most important of the Aramean kingdoms in the 9th to the 8th century, right? So it's just interesting that for someone that never studied these kinds of things all these years sitting in the Christian church, such as myself, I never knew this stuff. It's like you're taught such basic things when you sit in church all those years. They just want you to be buried in the New Testament. Bury your mind in the New Testament, and you don't have a clue about world geography as it relates to the Old Testament, upon which it is said the New Testament rests, right? It gets its foundation from, it says. So how can you not know the geography, the lands, the peoples of the Old Testament to properly understand why certain things happen in the New Testament, if the New Testament is really correct and true. Right? But if Abraham was in Syria, then he would have been a Syrian. He would have been Syrian, or at least living as a Syrian or like a Syrian. Right? But when you look at that word Syria some more, you see, of course, Damascus pop up, and now you see Aram Damascus, and Aram, of course, is dealing with Aram, Aramaean, Aramea, Aramaic. Right? So it's telling you something very important there about Syria. That while we are used to the modern word Syria, a place they're bombing over there right now, they've been fighting for a couple of years now. While we're used to the word Syria, you won't normally, even though you should, think of the word Aram or Aramea. Those words should be coming to mind, right? So when you look at Damascus, Syria, you can equally think of Damascus, Aram, or Aram, Damascus, Syria. Now, I'm going to read something about Abraham here in a moment. Before that, let's take a look here at some more information of Aram. Where is Aram? Again, this is from Wikipedia. Aram is a region mentioned in the Bible, located in present-day central Syria. Let me read that again for the new ones of us trying to learn the Old Testament and don't know the geography. As myself, I'm just learning the geography of the Old Testament. Aram is a region mentioned in the Bible, located in present-day central Syria. All the years sitting in church, maybe for the day of Pentecost stuff, they might have mentioned the word Syria for something. Other than that, I would have just heard it on the news, like they're in the news right now, Syria. But they never taught me basic sense and common sense regarding the Old Testament lands and so on. So that I did not know and didn't think it important to make the connection between Aram and Syria. Come on, especially the people in the Christian church sitting down there year after year, start to learn some things. You're going to figure out certain things, right? If you can just pay attention to some stuff in the Old Testament a little bit more. I'm not insulting you. I'm saying that you're listening to someone who spent years in the Christian church, helped to start daughter churches and so on, preaching like crazy on my way to becoming a pastor, right? Just about to pastor church, launch church, had functioned as assistant pastor a couple of times, and so on, and walked away from all of that because I found the truth of the Most High in the Old Testament. I walked away from all of that. And Christians just feel like anybody who leaves a Christian church, they're just deceived. And they never can show you any set of information to do a proper, serious discussion with you. Right? Because as soon as you start to sound a little bit, for want of a better word, intellectual or knowledgeable about things that are not New Testament, meaning you're talking about Old Testament lifestyle and culture, to show how certain things in the New Testament cannot possibly be true. Once you show yourself as having left the Christian church because of Old Testament information that you have now learned, which was sitting there all along, you just never read it and studied it. Once you show that kind of information, they write you off. They don't want to talk to you anymore because they're not going to study that Old Testament stuff. They only know New Testament, and they just want to quote a few New Testament verses, and they can't reason with you and come to the point where they understand. Obviously, me just quoting 10 more New Testament verses is no match for your 1 Old Testament knowledge plus 2 your Old Testament knowledge of how the people lived in their lands and according to their cultures and so on in the old times. They don't think that kind of information has value, so they just leave, right? and they don't want to talk to you anymore. But for the ones who want to learn some more, yeah, you got to dig into these things, right? So Aram includes, is located in present-day central Syria, including where the city of Aleppo, also known as Halab, now stands. Aram stretched from the Lebanon mountains eastward across the Euphrates, including the Khabur River Valley in northwestern Mesopotamia on the border of Assyria. I'm going to have some stuff to say about Assyria as time goes on because I've been looking into that lately, and that's one of the reasons why I got this book anyway. But later I'm going to mention some stuff on Assyria. All right? But if you look here now, so they're making a connection between Aram and Syria. Let me read about Abraham, and then I'm going to read from one more website, the Encyclopedia Judaica Virtual Library, from Jewish Virtual Library, I think, .org. So let me read from the book, and then I'll run to their website and tell you something about Abraham. Again, the book, The Assyrians, the oldest Christian people. If you want to take a look at it and see this, I can't tell you which page because this book doesn't have page numbers, but it's probably, I don't know, 4th, 5th page or something like that. The Law of Moses, this is subtitled The Wandering Aramaean. You could probably just say The Wandering Syrian. See that? Or The Wandering Aramaean who spoke Aramaic, or something like that, right? I'm trying to get your mind away from thinking that Abraham spoke Hebrew, because it doesn't appear to me that he spoke Hebrew, unless there is some kind of trick, which I'll find out as I study more, that shows that Hebrew was really what they spoke, and maybe it later became called Aramaic, or it was in a different form, some ancient form and whatever, and we've just been given the modern changed up form that's called Hebrew, right? But otherwise, the wandering Aramaean who spoke Aramaic, it seems. The law of Moses required the Israelites to recite annually, "A wandering Aramaean was my father." Right? And they're talking about Abraham. So what they're telling you here is that Abraham was an Aramaean. And the Aramaean, they're going to let you know, would be speaking not Hebrew, but Aramaic. Now, was this the Jews' language? Or might I say properly the Hebrews' language? So a wandering Aramaean was my father, in order to remind themselves that they descended from Aramaic nomads. In other words, that to remind themselves, Moses told them to repeat this, that a wandering Aramaean was their father, to remind themselves that they descended from Syrian nomads, or nomads in Aram. Right? Now, let me read that verse for you. It's in Deuteronomy, chapter 26, verse 5. "And thou shalt speak and say before the Most High thy power, A Syrian ready to perish was my father." See, they're calling it Syrian, right? But when you look at it, it really means Aramaean. And if I click on that word Syrian, where it says a Syrian ready to perish was my father, basically it's saying that Syrian, when I click on it, is Aramean, right? Which means Syrian or Aramean, meaning exalted. So basically, they're letting you know Abraham was a Syrian or an Aramean, right? And it goes on to say here, a thing or person from Syria or Aram. That's what they mean by Syrian in that verse from Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. Right? From Syria or Aram. If you click on it, go down some more, it says an Aramite or Aramean, Syrian or Aramites, right? And it says it's linked to another word, Aram, or Aramaeans, again meaning exalted, right? So it's dealing with Aram or Syria, the nation, the Syrian or Aramaean people. Nothing here so far about the Hebrew people or the Hebrew-speaking people. You see where I'm getting at? That somehow this Hebrew wasn't so mentioned way back then, but seems to have popped up or surfaced in later times. And I'm going to give you a clue to that, right? So I'm just taking down Hebrew off its high chair for a little bit so we can consider, right, whether this Hebrew really stacks up that we've got here in our Strong's Concordance and lexicons today, right? Consider whether or not it has its real proper place in the scriptures or not, because we're saying we've got the Hebrew in the scrolls and that's what it was written in. But I mean, you just wonder, because you see, I don't know how to show it yet. And it could be that I'll end up being wrong on this point. But you see, I'm not as concerned about being wrong these days, now that I've found out this whole trick of Christianity that I gave my life to, and this trick of this 2,000-year-old Mashiach. I'm not so concerned anymore about being wrong. I'm more concerned about being correct, about finding truth. So I will take the risk to consider things in order to dig to find the truth. If you are too afraid, you're going to run the risk of not uncovering truth. The Most High has told us time and time again that the scribes and the priests, they're corrupt. If they were handling the law books, you don't think they're going to hide stuff in the way they word it? And don't divorce that from the modern day translations that we've been given, right? Because I know they're going to tell you, oh, but the Dead Sea Scrolls were found and so on. Yeah, sure. Come on, I'm trying to get people to think. Like I said, I don't know how to show it or prove it yet. Because I'm not as well studied as some others who have been looking into these issues for like 20 years, 15 years and longer and so on, right? So I'm just like a new kid on the block in this. But I just have this kind of feeling that somehow if we have found Dead Sea Scrolls, and everybody's like, yeah, see, our Bible is true because Dead Sea Scrolls, those are earlier scrolls that we found, right? And so it agrees with everything, whatever, for the most part, and all the minor differences in whatever. But basically they're saying, yeah, Dead Sea Scrolls. And now, but you see, my problem is twofold, which I mentioned already in another recording, is that one, it's interesting that a real Hebrew of a so-called black nation that got scattered in slavery, we just can't seem to be the ones finding all these scrolls in the Qumran caves and in Syria, other places where they said they found. None of us can seem to find these scrolls. And while my focus is not money, but even get rich off it or make money off it, but somebody else is making money and getting rich off it, the scrolls were given to us, but we can't seem to find them. But these scrolls, which are used to pull off massive religious deception across the earth. Because even though we're finding truth in them, they're still used to deceive, right? Because they're not telling who the people of the Most High really are and so on. And they're not exposed. But it's like, we can't, the real people, find those scrolls. But somebody else is finding the scrolls all the time. And it's in their control all the time. And when they feel to release it to us, then they release it to the world. And only the Most High knows what really goes on behind the scenes prior to them releasing it and say, yeah, these scrolls are now ready. But yeah, we aren't the ones finding them. Like, why not? Why is that so difficult? Maybe it's because we are the people of the book, and like the book says in so many places, we'd be washed up. We'd be knocked out of the picture, don't even know our head from our foot. Jeremiah 17:4, right? That we'd be losing our identity, losing everything, like, I mean, we just confusion of faces and whatever. So we're not going to be in the cut when it comes to these scrolls, right? And my next problem is that when they find the scrolls, apparently, for the most part, it seems that we're presented with some Hebrew writings. Yet, as I showed already, Hebrew seems to have surfaced fairly late. Why weren't the scrolls written in those other languages, seeing that Hebrew came later on the scene? Why is it that the scrolls are never found, or pieces of the scroll? You talk about silver scroll, all kind. Why don't they find some scrolls with ancient Israelite or writings from the people of Shem in a language that we don't know, which would make the people looking at the scroll say, maybe this was the Jews' language? Huh? You got this mysterious thing, the Jews' language. But everything we find is Hebrew, and they're telling us Hebrew is the language of the Bible and not the Hebrew spoke. But Hebrew came on later, if you look it up online. And there were languages before Hebrew came along. So, I don't know, the whole thing is just strange. But this is saying here, when you deal with the Syrian, you're talking about the Syrian or Aramaean people. So now, if I finish reading this verse from Deuteronomy 26:5, and thou shalt speak and say before the Most High thy power, a Syrian or an Aramean ready to perish was my father. And he went down into Egypt and sojourned there and with a few and became there a nation, great, mighty, and populous. Right? And then it goes on to say that the Egyptians evil entreated us there and afflicted us and so on, brought us into hard bondage. So now if I continue from the book now, he's saying that Moses told him to repeat this stuff to them, that they wouldn't forget that they descended from Aramaic nomads. Right? In Deuteronomy 26:5, Abraham was the Aramaic nomad or the Syrian nomad that they remembered, right? And they remembered that he came, Abraham, from Ur of the Chaldees in southern Iraq, right? Look at Genesis 11:31, and they give a New Testament verse, Acts 7:2. I won't bother to stop to read them. In the 1920s, archaeologists excavated Ur and discovered that Abraham had come from a technologically advanced civilization. So, right, so that would fit as well the people of Shem, because they must be all up in that, right? No matter who else might have been living there. Abraham, the Aramaic prophet, is considered the founder. And see why I say advanced civilization, because remember, even Noah, Joseph went down to Egypt and taught them wisdom, but even Noah had built an ark that lasted long enough to ride out the flood that destroyed everyone else. Right? So you're talking about technologically advanced. Yeah. Abraham, the Aramaic prophet, is considered the founder of the monotheistic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. That's what they're saying there. But they're saying Abraham was Aramaic. They're not telling us that Abraham was Hebrew. But we call Abraham. So now when you get verses like, if Aramaic is really the language, when you get verses like the God of the Hebrews, should it be saying the God of the Arameans? I don't know. But okay, so they're basically telling you that Abraham spoke Aramaic then, right? Now, if we look here from the Encyclopedia Judaica from JewishVirtualLibrary.org, it's dealing with Aramaeans, and it says the Aramaeans are a group of Western Shemitic, they're saying Semitic, but we know it's Shemitic, Aramaic speaking tribes, right? So that means that we can understand that the Syrians or the Aramaic people or the people of Aram, where Abraham came from, were Western Shemitic Aramaic speaking tribes. So they spoke Aramaic. So why are we getting words of Abraham in our Bibles where when we look into the Hebrew words to them, it's showing Abraham speaking Hebrew when they spoke Aramaic? Abraham, they're telling us here, spoke Aramaic. Again, if anybody has better light to shed on this, help me out. Right? But I'm going through all of this because in order to search and find out certain truths, because as we get closer to the end, we're going to rock and shock each other more and more with the things that we pull out of this scripture. Right? Why? Because more things are going to come to light the later it gets, until in the end, the Most High is just going to put the real Torah in our hearts, so we're going to wonder, what in the world have we been reading all these years? You really don't think there's some scrolls out there that haven't been presented to us? If the Babylonians had our scrolls, if the Chaldeans, if the Syrians, if all these other nations were around us, injuring us, torturing us, the Egyptians enslaving us, bondage, whatever, and they had our scrolls or our history and so on, you don't think that in some way they would have tampered with our scrolls? So that by the time you hear that some Dead Sea Scrolls were found in Qumran caves, and they're like, yeah, so the Bible is true, it agrees with everything. Yeah, it would agree with it, if I'm correct, because they might have been giving you this modern Bible from the Dead Sea Scrolls that were hidden back then. Because I think, I can't show it properly, but I think they hid those scrolls knowing that they were not the complete and proper scrolls. That's what I personally think. Now, I'm not saying they're all wrong, right? But I just think from different things that I've read, which I can't bring out here, that certain things might have been changed in those scrolls along the way, so that by the time it gets translated and it comes over to us in Greek and in English, this is just what we have and this is just what we know as truth. But the Most High told us in other places, but like in Jeremiah 23 and in Jeremiah 8 verse 8, that the pen of the scribes is in vain. Obviously, he's telling you that the scribes are writing things to trick his people, to lead them away from truth. So by the time you find some Dead Sea Scrolls that came from scribes, are you still left to think that there is no way that these scrolls that were hidden were tampered with at some point in history by the so-called Hebrew scribes or the Aramaic scribes or whatever you want to call them, the Israelite scribes? But Israelite scribes who had to go through domination of captivity in places like Iraq or Babylon, under Babylonian captivity and in other times. You don't think at some point through our captivities that these nations would have pressured or forced our scribes to change up stuff? And not change 99% of the book, because that would be silly, but maybe change only 2%, only half a percent, or something small, right? Or just change the name of the Most High, or something, or just drop off a letter of this and that word here and there. You don't think some changes happened when the Most High is saying the pen of the scribes were doing something wrong? It must have happened, or the Most High wouldn't say that. So you see where I'm coming from? I know some people are going to write me off, but listen, you're listening to the same guy who had to sit down and listen to Hebrew camps tell me after I left the Christian church to still worship a 2,000-year-old Mashiach, only to find that he's got some serious problems with him. As in the case of how the New Testament was written, where I told you already that there seems to be some serious problem with Nazareth, which apparently did not exist up to 100 years before this 2,000-year-old Mashiach was said to have been born. I don't know. So yeah, I gotta search things out because I want to be saved in the end, right? You see what I'm saying? By the Most High. I want to be rescued by the Most High. As someone who wanted truth so bad that he was willing to search and dig. If people are digging in Qumran caves and digging elsewhere all over the earth looking for our scrolls and posing like they're us, if they're digging the physical earth and I can't, shouldn't I at least dig through the words that they give me in these scriptures and in these Hebrew words and so on to try to find whatever truth I can to piece things together? And when I do that, I find this and that don't make sense, but this and that over here, that makes sense. Yeah, I gotta search and dig, right? Actually, let me just break this and just read a scripture that seems so fitting right here. All right, I was looking for another verse, but this one popped up at me from Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 1 to 3. To everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under the heaven. So I went through a time in my life where it just seemed to be a time to sit down and learn. But now, after learning so many things that I'm finding to be fake, not just with the Bible, but fake with the earth, because we're living in a pagan world, but I was taught all my life in the Christian church that the pagan world was back then. When we're driving in cars dedicated to pagan gods, right? Look at all the names of these cars: Ford, Dodge, Ram, Lexus, Mazda. Some or all of those car names you see out there are names of pagan gods. And you're telling me the pagan world was only back then? In New Testament times and before that? No, we're still living in it. And if I don't search like this, then I wouldn't be finding out these things. Right? So everybody's got to be searching, right? And the Bible does say, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge, right? So I'm teaching some knowledge here, teaching you to dig and to search, right? And you're going to be surprised at the different things that you find out. So it goes on a time and purpose for everything under heaven. So now I'm just in a time where once I sat and I learned, I'm now in a time where I'm not just going to sit down and learn alone. I'm still going to do that, listen to other people, but I'm in a time where I'm going to dig and search for myself as well and try to verify what I'm learning from somebody else. Try to prove it for myself. Right? You should do the same as well. A time to be born and a time to die. So from one extreme to the next, a time to be born and to come into the world, and then a time to die. You see how drastic he's making this sound? One extreme to the next. I'm saying drastic because that's exactly what I'm doing here with the scriptures. So when you think, oh brother, you're going off now talking about, oh, there might have been problems with the scrolls and Hebrews or poem or whatever. There's just a time to dig up, a time to uproot stuff. Drastic extremes, right? Because how are you going to find truth? Truth has been so carefully hidden by our captors. You got to carefully search. A time to pluck up that which is planted. So if some scrolls were planted by the so-called Essenes, who they said might have hid them in the Qumran caves, right? And if these books that we call Bibles were planted in bookstores and now online for us to buy them and read them and say, this is the word of God. If these books were planted all around us to find and say, this is God's word, should there also be a time in your life where you begin to pluck up these books that were planted? That's called the Bible, the different versions of the Bible. Shouldn't you come into a time in your life where you begin to pluck up these Bible planted books and dig into them and look to see what's the real credibility of these books that we call the Bible? when we know even the word Bible itself seems to be of some pagan origin? So verse 3, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up. So yeah, I'm going to break down some of the knowledge I have and some of the belief I have that the Hebrew is just the way it is, and the Bible is just the way it is, and the scrolls is just the way they are, right? And that they're just from God directly. I'm going to break that down, break it up, and try to dissect it and take it apart, look at it, examine it for myself, because in those same scrolls I read in Jeremiah 8:8 that the Most High complained about the scribes and exposed them. All right? So now you see where I'm coming from. I'm not doing something that the Most High didn't even address before, right? Yeah, so I don't know. Anyway, if I go back now to continue reading now, the Aramaeans were a Western Semitic Aramaic-speaking tribe of people who spread over the Fertile Crescent during the last quarter of the second millennium BCE, right? 11th and 10th century royal inscriptions from Assyria and Babylonia indicate Aramean movements through the north of the Middle Euphrates and northern Mesopotamia. In other words, the Arameans, okay, I don't need any more of this, right? Okay, as I go down some more in this article, you can read it yourself. It's starting to mention something about the importance, only one generation removed from Shem reflects the importance of the Arameans in the Near East during the first third of the first millennium BCE. So I don't know, it seems like they're trying to show that somehow in history it has been found that only one generation from Shem is showing some importance of the Arameans. So somehow they're saying uh, the people of Shem and the Arameans have some connection, right? Again, they're not seeming to be so concerned about mentioning the actual word Hebrew, but they keep mentioning Arameans and Aramaic, right? And we find that Abraham was a Syrian or an Aramaic, right? While the Old Testament is largely written in Hebrew, now this is what they're telling us now from this book, the Assyrians, right? They're telling us that the Old Testament was largely written in Hebrew, which is what the knowledge we have been given today. But we're finding that they were speaking Aramaic. So my thing is, even if it was written in Hebrew, that could have just been the last set of scrolls that we have to use today, that we have access to. But they would have more been speaking Aramaic, as we're seeing here. Abraham was actually speaking that, and most likely would have been writing in Aramaic, documenting something, right? So the Old Testament is largely written in Hebrew. Portions of it are written in Aramaic. Okay, no. They're saying while the Old Testament is largely written in Hebrew, portions of it are written in Aramaic. So Hebrew wasn't around back then in Abraham's time, the way we have Hebrew today, the way we know Hebrew today. Yet they're telling you that it was largely written in Hebrew. Well, if these people were speaking Aramaic, why wasn't it largely written in Aramaic? Who was documenting the words of people like Noah and Abraham and all the other Shemitic people dealing with the Most High? Who was writing down their words in Hebrew when Hebrew didn't exist? Wouldn't they have been writing it down in Aramaic, and then later on somehow it got ported over into Hebrew? Unless, like I'm saying, somehow it was Hebrew, but they're telling us it was called Aramaic. I don't know, it's all confusing, right? But you see what I'm getting at? Is that if you're not digging and searching, you're not even gonna be aware that there's some confusion out there on this or that topic. You're just gonna accept what you're taught, accept what you're told. right? But no, I want to search and dig. And of course, I'm going to be making more videos as I learn more on this topic, right? To share what I'm finding as I go, because right now I don't have anything definitive, but so far it seems like Aramaic was around before Hebrew, unless we're going to be told that the ancient form of Aramaic was actually called Hebrew, right? So, the books of the Old Testament, according to traditional Jewish information, all three sections of the Bible contain Aramaic. And they're saying here, according to Jewish legends, Adam and Eve spoke Aramaic in the Garden of Eden. Laban the Aramean spoke in Aramaic when he made a covenant with Jacob in Genesis 31, verse 47. The sons of Deborah also seems to be influenced by Aramaic, as in Judges chapter 5. So you see that? All these people were dealing with Aramaic, but we're given a Bible in Hebrew. Is it possible that there was some switch made along the way to hide and cover up some things that you can't fully understand in Hebrew as you could come closer to the truth in Aramaic? The same way you can't fully understand some things in the Bible in English as you can more closer get to the truth in Hebrew. So it's the same way that probably you can get even closer to the truth leaving Hebrew and crossing over to Aramaic. You see what I'm saying? Well, these different people were speaking Aramaic. They're telling us, right? So all these people apparently were speaking Aramaic, but we are given a Bible in Hebrew, and we are told and taught that they spoke Hebrew. We're taught that in pulpits, we're taught that in camps, we're taught that in universities, we're taught that everywhere, we're taught that in the bookstores and the books we buy, that they spoke Hebrew. And only people who decide to, if I didn't pick up this book and decide to buy it and start looking into it, I would know this. That these people were speaking Aramaic if I wasn't intent on studying this topic, right? But they were speaking Aramaic. Now, I can't prove that Adam and Eve were speaking Aramaic, but I have heard it before, and here Jewish legends are saying that, right? That they spoke Aramaic. During the reign of Hezekiah, Judean negotiators requested to speak in Aramaic, see that? The language of diplomacy, to the Assyrian ambassador in Isaiah 36 and verse 13. Aramaic apparently, is used. Naaman, the Aramaic general, was healed upon being baptized at the prophet Elisha's command, and his faith was praised by the 2,000-year-old Mashiach in Luke chapter 4, verse 27. This is funny, I thought to add this to my New Testament is Fake series with this, because it's like they're using this story here of this general being healed in the water to try to prove the truthfulness of this 2,000-year-old Mashiach. But I find something fishy about that, so I might have to look to that and bring that out one day. Jeremiah's prophecy to the nations is also written in Aramaic, in Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 11. So again, his prophecy is written to the nations in Aramaic, right? So, alright, so as I won't read any more from this book, I'll just mention some of the titles here, like this one, Balaam, son of Beor, the Aramaic prophet. So again, you got these different people speaking Aramaic in the early part of the book of even Genesis, but we're given a Bible in Hebrew. You see what I'm saying? The ancient Assyrians as well. I don't know, it's like Prophet Daniel and the Babylonian captivity. The most popular piece of Aramaic literature is the book of the prophet Daniel. exiled from the Holy Land to Iraq for the Babylonian captivity, right? So now here's my question that comes at the end now, which I mentioned at the start, to mention something strange about Hebrew. And this is what I'll close with. They're saying here, okay, we went into Iraq for the Babylonian captivity. And they're saying during this time, during the Babylonian captivity, which is a generation in which the Judeans spent in exile in Iraq. Right? So the captivity in Iraq or in Babylon. This is probably the time in which the common language of most Israelites transitioned from Hebrew to its sister language, Aramaic. Right? Because Hebrew seems to have come on the scene probably 1000 BC, something like that. And we know these captivities for the northern and southern kingdoms came about probably about 300 years or so after Hebrew was said to have come on the scene. Right? So that means that they weren't speaking Hebrew all along, then they were speaking Aramaic or something else. But we do see that these different people are mentioned here were speaking Aramaic. Now, if it was in this time that the Hebrews transitioned from Hebrew to its sister language Aramaic, and the Babylonian captivity lasted from 586 BC until 537 BC, then what they're really saying to you is that the Hebrews or the Judeans went into the Babylonian captivity, and during that time they transitioned from or left off speaking Hebrew and started speaking its sister language Aramaic. So now my problem is this. All along, as I pointed out, Abraham and others seems to have been speaking Aramaic. So Aramaic was more like the standard language of the people of Shem. So Aramaic was the language being spoken. Yet they're telling you here that according to their checks in history for writing this book, they found that it was during the Babylonian captivity that Israel or Judah switched from Hebrew to Aramaic. If they were speaking if they were speaking Aramaic all along, so that they could learn of Abraham's teachings and so on and whatever, wouldn't it have more been the case that they were speaking Aramaic, went into Babylonian captivity with Aramaic, and transitioned from Aramaic to Hebrew, which is Hebrew that we have now? But instead they're saying, by history here, that they were speaking Aramaic all along from Abraham and all them, and as soon as they get into the Babylonian captivity, they switched to Aramaic. How can you be speaking Aramaic all along and switch to Aramaic? If they're speaking Aramaic all along, how can they switch from Hebrew to Aramaic? It doesn't make sense. If they're speaking Aramaic all along, Noah, Shem, and from Adam and Eve and so on, as I pointed out, apparently, Laban and all them, and Jeremiah and all, if they're speaking Aramaic all this time, then they would have gone into the captivity speaking Aramaic and switched to Hebrew. But what they're making us to think here is that they're speaking Aramaic all along, but when they went into the captivity, they switched from Hebrew to Aramaic. How does the Hebrew come into the picture? If you have any clearer understanding that can help me, maybe I'm missing something, you know? If you, if you got better information, as I'm sure there's lots of people who have clearer information, post it up underneath, type it in or whatever, or, so that we can look at this, because I'm looking for truth and I wanna find out some stuff, because there's some words that I'm looking at and some things looking in for different topics that have nothing to do with this. that are important to me. And I'm trying to zone in on the language, right? Because somehow this Hebrew language stuff seems to be tricky, seeing that there were different languages before Hebrew came along. And if there were other languages like that, especially that the Hebrews might have been speaking, or the people of Shem, where did this mysterious Hebrew come from?